April 21st, 1972. Inside a spacecraft more than 200,000 miles from Earth, Apollo 16 carried a small packet of compressed cheese and cracker cubes, engineered so they would not crumble and float through the cabin. By then, astronauts were being fed about 2,800 calories a day, and one of humanity's oldest preserved foods had followed them all the way into deep space. Today, the world produces nearly 23 million metric tons of cheese a year, and the United States alone turns out more than 14 billion pounds of it. That is how far one accident can travel. Cheese matters more than most people think. But this story does not start there. It starts somewhere much earlier, in a harsher world, with heat, hunger, and a skin bag full of milk. No one can point to a single inventor. That is part of the mystery. One ancient legend says an Arabian traveler poured milk into a pouch lined with an animal's stomach and crossed a hot desert, only to discover at day's end that the liquid had separated into curds and whey. Whether that exact scene happened or not, the chemistry behind it was real. Rennet from a stomach lining, warmth from the sun, movement from a journey. And suddenly milk, which spoils fast, became something denser, salter, tougher, and far more durable. The first cheeses would not have resembled the neat wedges in a supermarket case. They would have been rough, sour, often oversalted, sometimes gritty, sometimes smoky, a survival food before it was a luxury. The earliest direct evidence is startlingly old. Archaeologists working in Poland found perforated ceramic sieves dating back about 7,000 years, and chemical analysis of fatty acids trapped in clay showed that these vessels had been used to process milk into dairy products that were almost certainly cheese. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not. For early farmers, cheesemaking solved several problems at once. It preserved nutrition in a transportable form, reduced the lactose that many prehistoric adults could not digest, and turned a fragile daily product into stored wealth. In ancient Egypt, evidence pushes the story in another direction. A Dynasty I tomb at Saqqara, dating to roughly 3100 to 2910 BCE, contained jars whose residue matched cheese-like material, and another discovery from the tomb of Tammuz, a high official under Seti I and Ramesses II, revealed a 3,200-year-old solid cheese made from mixed animal milk. Researchers also found traces of a bacterium associated with brucellosis. Even at the beginning, cheese carried both nourishment and risk. As herding spread, so did the craft. Sheep, goats, and cattle all produced milk, but milk alone was unstable. Cheese was the answer to distance, seasons, and uncertainty. In the eastern Mediterranean and across the Near East, cheesemakers learned to salt, press dry, and age curds in ways that matched local climates. Some cheeses were fresh and eaten quickly. Others were hardened enough to travel. In dry zones, salt preserved them. In cooler mountain zones, caves did the work. And this is where everything changed. Cheese stopped being merely a byproduct of milk and became a strategy for storing calories, protein, and trade value in a form that could survive roads, ships, and war. By the time of the classical empires, cheese had become ordinary and important at the same time. The Greeks knew it as a staple rather than a curiosity, and the Romans helped push it across an enormous territory. Cheese was made in many parts of the Roman Empire at its height, and Roman influence helped carry cheesemaking into places like Britain. This is a part of the story that most people never learn. Empires are not held together by marble alone. They are held together by logistics, grain, oil, wine, salt, and preserved foods. Cheese belonged to that world because it condensed pasture into something portable. A wheel of cheese was land made edible later, a ration for a soldier, a cargo for a merchant, a tax payment, a household reserve against winter. After Rome fractured, cheesemaking did not disappear. It narrowed, localized, and deepened. In medieval Europe, monasteries became laboratories of patience. Monks refined methods, stabilized recipes, and preserved traditions that might otherwise have vanished. Gorgonzola is recorded in Italy by 879, and Roquefort appears in records from a monastery at Conques as early as 1070. Cave aging, regional molds, washing techniques, repeated turning, and the disciplined management of humidity turned accident into craft. But Europe was not the only place developing a sophisticated dairy culture. In the medieval Islamic world, food writing exploded. Around the 10th century, Baghdad stood at the center of one of the richest culinary cultures on earth, and the earliest known Arabic cookbook, attributed to Ibn Sayyar al-Warraq, gathered 615 recipes from more than 20 cookbooks. Among the foods praised in poetry and served in elite circles was kamek, a kind of countertop cheese, while other dishes incorporated cheese into layered, prepared cuisine. Caravans crossed the city carrying spices, grains, fruits, and ideas, and cheese moved with them, not as a peasant afterthought, but as part of a highly literate food civilization. Then came ships, then came colonies, then came a much larger world. Cheese crossed the Atlantic with settlers because it had one enormous advantage. It traveled better than milk. The Pilgrims included cheese in the Mayflower's provisions in 1620, and wherever Europeans carried livestock, they carried the logic of cheesemaking too. In mountain valleys, colonial farms, mission settlements, and port towns, milk had to be stabilized fast. Butter was one option. Cheese was the other. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not. A farm that could preserve milk could survive longer, trade farther, and waste less. In many places, cheese became a bridge between subsistence and market economy. By the 19th century, the old village craft was beginning to industrialize. In 1851, Jesse Williams built the first cheese factory in the United States in Oneida County, New York, and what had long been a farm-by-farm activity started to centralize. In 1845, Swiss immigrants settled in Greene County, Wisconsin, and by 1868, Wisconsin's first Limburger plant had opened. Then the numbers exploded. By 1880, the United States had 3,923 dairy factories producing 216 million pounds of cheese valued at $17 million, representing nearly 90% of total production. By 1904, factory output had passed 317 million pounds. And this is where everything changed. Standardization began to defeat seasonality. Railway transport expanded distribution. Cities created demand that small farms alone could not satisfy. Cheese was no longer just local memory. It was becoming industry. That industrial leap reshaped taste itself. Traditional cheeses were tied to place, weather, animals, pasture, microbes, and habit. Industrial cheeses had to be tied to predictability. The famous example came in 1916, when James Lewis Kraft received a patent describing a method of heating and stirring cheddar into a homogeneous product that could be packed into jars or cans. The original goal was practical: improve shelf life and allow shipment to warmer climates. But there was a problem. Shelf life, affordability, and uniformity always come with trade-offs. Processed cheese helped solve distribution at scale, and over time it became one of the world's leading cheese categories. But it also marked a turning point where the old link between cheese and terroir began to loosen. What mattered now was not just flavor. It was stability, price, melt, and reach. Cheese became so strategic that war touched it directly. During the Second World War, rationing systems in Britain and the United States folded cheese into the arithmetic of survival. Hard cheeses could be portioned, shipped, and controlled. Civilian diets bent around military need. Entire local traditions were compressed by the state into what could move efficiently and feed predictably. That may sound mundane. It was not. When governments ration a food, they are admitting that it matters to national endurance. But the darkest chapter was not about flavor or even war. It was about trust. Milk and cheese are intimate foods. They are often given to children, to the sick, to the poor, and to people who assume they are safe. This is the part that should make you angry. By 1938, about 25% of all disease outbreaks from contaminated food and water were attributed to milk. After pasteurization spread in the late 1940s, milk-borne outbreaks dropped to less than 1%. The science was not subtle. Heating worked. Hygiene worked. Regulation worked. And yet the danger never entirely vanished. In California between 1971 and 1975, one dairy was linked to 35 of 44 Salmonella Dublin cases, an outbreak that caused 89 hospitalizations and 22 deaths. From 2007 to 2020, a review of North American outbreaks found 20 outbreaks tied to unpasteurized dairy products, causing 449 confirmed illnesses, 124 hospitalizations, and 5 deaths. Even pasteurized products were not beyond failure. 12 outbreaks caused 174 illnesses, 134 hospitalizations, 17 deaths, and 7 fetal losses. They knew that dairy safety depended on vigilance, and when that vigilance failed, people paid the price with their bodies. If you are finding this interesting, hit subscribe. We cover stories like this every week, and you will not want to miss what comes next. The remarkable thing is that cheese survived every one of those pressures and came out larger, more global, and more varied than ever. Today, global cheese production is forecast at about 22.89 million metric tons. The European Union alone accounts for roughly 10.81 million tons, nearly half of world production, while the United States stands at about 6.8 million tons in the latest forecast and produced 14.25 billion pounds in 2024. Russia contributes around 1.16 million tons. Brazil is near 820,000 tons. Argentina stands near 555,000. Canada produces roughly 522,000. The United Kingdom about 515,000. Mexico about 485,000. These are not just agricultural figures. They are a map of how an ancient accident became one of the most successful food technologies in human history. Trade tells the same story. The European Union exports around 1.37 million tons of cheese. The United States is expected to export more than 621,000 tons. New Zealand, though much smaller in absolute output, produces around 440,000 tons and exports about 425,000 of them, meaning much of what it makes is destined for other people's tables. Australia produces about 432,000 tons and exports around 175,000. This is the part of the story that most people never learn. Cheese is not only a food, it is a conversion system. Pasture into milk, milk into curd, curd into shelf life into trade, trade into states, markets, migration, and memory. Modern appetites are vast. In the United States, per person cheese consumption reached 41.9 pounds in 2024, while total dairy intake stood at 651 pounds per person on a milk-equivalent basis. Italian-style cheeses are the engine of that demand. In 2024, the United States produced 6.03 billion pounds of Italian varieties, and mozzarella alone accounted for 4.79 billion pounds, nearly 80% of that category. Pizza changed the dairy economy more than most people realize. Fast food, refrigerated transport, frozen storage, immigrant cuisines, and television advertising all help turn cheese from a regional preserve into an everyday expectation. And the strange part is that cheese keeps finding new frontiers. In April 1972, compressed cheese cracker cubes flew on Apollo 16, packaged so they would not crumble in microgravity. NASA's Modern Space Food Systems Laboratory now designs foods for missions lasting 6 months on the International Space Station and is preparing meals that may need to stay safe, nutritious, and appetizing for up to 5 years on future long-duration missions beyond low Earth orbit. A food once strained through clay in Neolithic Poland now has to survive spacecraft packaging and deep space storage protocols. That line from prehistory to orbit is almost absurd. It is also perfectly logical. Cheese has always been about making nutrition last longer than nature intended. Its byproducts have become industries of their own. Whey, once treated as waste, can account for 65 to 80% of the volume of processed milk in cheesemaking, and today it is turned into sports nutrition, infant formula, functional drinks, edible films, bioplastics, and even biofuels. What began as a liquid left behind after curdling has become a raw material for the circular economy. That humble separation of curd and whey, once discovered by accident in heat and motion, now feeds laboratories, packaging plants, and biotechnology. So the history of cheese is not only a story about taste. It is a story about preservation. It is a story about migration. It is a story about empire, monastery, caravan, colony, factory, regulation, and orbit. It was there when the first farmers learned that milk could be made safer by changing it. It was there when Egyptians sealed food for the dead. It was there when Roman trade routes tightened the Mediterranean. It was there when Baghdad gathered the cuisines of a wide world into books. It was there when ships crossed the Atlantic. It was there when factories remade the farm. It was there when war rationed calories. It was there when science fought disease. It was there when astronauts opened a packet above the moon. And that is why the story comes back so neatly to that sealed space food pouch from April 1972. Inside, it was not just a snack. It was 7,000 years of trial and error, herd management, fermentation, risk, invention, and human stubbornness, compressed into bite-sized cubes that would not scatter in zero gravity. From a skin bag in the desert to a laminated packet in a spacecraft, from tomb offerings to supermarket shelves, from monastery caves to freezer aisles, cheese has followed humanity because it solved one of our oldest problems: how to keep life going after milk should have spoiled. That answer is still with you now, wrapped in paper, tucked in a drawer, melting over dinner, or waiting in your kitchen right now. If this story surprised you, subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden histories behind everyday things.